What will you do with this wonderful, mysterious life that you have been given? Imagine that you were born in Africa 300,000 years ago, and that you experienced the whole life of the very first human being ever born. Then, immediately afterwards, you were to live the full life of the second human being, and then the third, and the fourth, and the fifth, and then every single human being since then, all the way to the baby being born as I complete this sentence. Your life would consist of all these lifetimes lived consecutively. Now, your experience would be very different than the history books. Famous people like the Buddha, Confucius, Mary, Isaac Newton, Jane Austen, these would only account for an infinitesimally small part of your experience. Most of your life would consist of ordinary social interactions. It would include a lot of worrying, working, and social conflict over status and inclusion. And you would feel a great deal of awe and transcendence too. This full life would last for 4 trillion years. A tenth of that time you would be a hunter-gatherer. For 60% of that time, you would be in a farming family. You would spend 20% of your time raising children, 20% growing food, 2% of your life would be dedicated to religious rituals like this one right here. And for 1% of your life, you would have malaria or smallpox. You would spend 1.5 billion years engaged in sex and 250 million years giving birth. You would experience terrible suffering, war, and brutality. For 10% of the time, you would own other human beings, and another 10%, you would be enslaved yourself. Now, this brings us to the unique circumstances of us as modern people. Because of the substantial population growth, nearly a third of your life would have occurred after the year 1200 AD, and a quarter of your whole life would have occurred since 1750. So as a result of this, many of your years you would experience as in terms of these massive social changes that came along with industrial revolution, with modern colonialism, the emergence of democracy, capitalism, contemporary science, the civil rights movement, etc. You would spend 150 years in outer space, and for 1 week, you would walk on the moon. 15% of your experience would be of people who are alive today. William McCaskill uses this thought experiment to give us an insight into the human nature and to the broader perspective of our place in the world. But he also does this to alert us to a pressing but overlooked issue, and that is our responsibility for the people of the future. He points out that if human beings as a species live as long as other mammalian species, like on average of 1 million years, and even at a population that was only a tenth of our current size, then only 99.5% of all human life would occur after this point. It seems very likely that the vast majority of all the people who will ever live have not been born yet, and we have a responsibility to them. We are the ancient ones. We are the forebearers, choosing a course that will bring suffering or joy to trillions of people who follow us. Jesus this morning presents us with another thought experiment that he hopes will also change our vision and how we live. The religious leaders who Luke notes are, quote, lovers of money, hear Jesus' parable from last week about the unrighteous manager, and they ridicule him. And Jesus responds saying, God knows your hearts, For what is prized by human beings is an abomination to God. And then he tells this story that we just heard in the gospel. And it's a story we at Grace Cathedral never hear, partly because it falls on the Sunday when we celebrate Michaelmas. When usually the bishop is here, we have special Michaelmas readings, so we skip this reading. And I myself haven't preached on this reading for 21 years. And so it's been such a joy to prepare for this morning and to think about this extraordinary story that Jesus told. But I need to give you a little background first. Luke, the author of this gospel, is somebody who cares intensely about poverty and equality and generosity. In his story, Jesus is born so poor, living in a barn. Mary in the Magnificat announces that God will fill the hungry with good things. There are scores of examples of Jesus preaching good news to the poor. And even in the second part of his other book, the book of Acts, Jesus describes an early church where all things were shared in common. And so this morning, Jesus is not giving us a philosophical dissertation on what the afterlife is going to be like. Instead, like the image of a 4 trillion year lifetime, the point of this picture is to wake us up so that we can see the world as it really is. A rich man in purple delights in his sensuality and his daily feasts. And at his gate, Lazarus longs for leftovers. The dogs lick his sores. His name, El-Azar, means God helps, or God has helped, or God will help. It's not clear from the verb tense. And we wonder, don't you wonder if during their life, the rich man even knew what Lazarus' name was? So the two die, and the rich man sees Lazarus from Hades, and Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham. It's a wonderful image. And the rich man calls out, "Father Abraham, Eleazon, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to cool my tongue." Abraham points out the chasm that separates them, the two realms. And then the rich man goes on and he says, "Abraham, send Lazarus to warn my 5 siblings about what could happen to them." And Abraham concludes the story saying that if the rich man's siblings do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And I just would love to do a whole sermon on what would you believe if you saw someone rise from the dead, but we don't have time for that today. We have time for this other sermon and these other 3 points that I'm going to make. One thing I love about this story is that Lazarus is the one who has the name. He's the one who is honored. And what strikes me with such force is that for over his whole life, the rich man has been building up a kind of wall, an absolute barrier between himself and Lazarus. And that even after death, even when everything should be completely clear to him, the rich man cannot see Lazarus' humanity. He looks at Lazarus at the bosom of Abraham, and he cannot recognize him as anything other than his inferior, as someone who exists to serve him. Like, why doesn't he yell up, "Hey, Lazarus, forgive me for all the ways I ignored you"? Or, "Hey, Lazarus, could you do me a favor and dip your tongue and your finger into the cold water"? He doesn't apologize to Lazarus. He doesn't even address him. Now, sharing what we have in terms of our material goods is difficult. But really seeing the humanity and dignity of the other people we encounter, that might be even harder. Every time I walk through the city of San Francisco, there are times I'm wearing a clerical collar, and there are times when I'm not wearing a clerical collar. And when I'm wearing a clerical collar, the place in the city that I get the most respect, do you know where that is? It's like walking through the Tenderloin, walking in the midst of people who have so little, have almost nothing. And when I look at them and say hi and they look back, there's an encounter there because there's a sense of hope that we'll each see the dignity and the worth of each other when we have those interactions. Now, we have so much in our lives, so many chances to see beyond those walls and into the dignity of another person. Earlier in the book of Luke, John the Baptist warns the people who come out to the desert to see him. He says, "Do not begin to say to yourselves, 'We have Abraham as our ancestor,' for I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham." So for Luke, what matters is not who your people are, what tribe you belong to. It is about what you do and how you repent. In the 3rd century, St. Augustine in Africa understood this. He was a 30-year-old and he was experiencing every possible form of success. He was wildly popular. He had a beautiful concubine, a wonderful son, a prestigious professorship. He had a brilliant career and he had the prospects of great wealth through a strategic marriage. But Augustine, he felt miserable. He writes, quote, "I panted for honors, for money, for marriage. And yet, despite getting everything that he could imagine getting, he was still profoundly unhappy." One day, Augustine was walking around and he was feeling this career pressure. He was feeling stressed out at work because he had to make a speech praising the emperor and he had to deliver that speech in public and he wasn't sure if what he was saying was true. And he noticed a very, very poor man by the side of the road who was drunk and who was laughing. And it occurred to him that if somebody asked him whether he would rather be by the side of the road drunk and laughing or whether he would rather be himself, he would rather be that person by the side of the road. But by the same token, he felt so much like he couldn't give up those honors and that station in society. He felt trapped by those circumstances. Eventually, Augustine began to see that faith is not a mental state of believing, but it's a changed life that's based on trusting in God. And something in him began to trust God, and he was able to leave those honors that were trapping him and confining him. And he became capable of receiving true joy. And when you read the rest of his autobiography, that joy is what stands out most about his life. The last thing I want to point out about this important story that Jesus tells is the number of times that Jesus basically says that Moses and the prophets are enough. We don't need, Jesus doesn't bring something different or something new. We're not leaving behind Judaism. Those examples of wisdom that the Jews have known about for so many centuries, that's still what is true today, and that's all that we need today. In our Sunday school, we teach our children about what a prophet is. A prophet is someone who is so close to God, and God is so close to them that they know what they should do. And we see prophets in many other religions and many other fields. And today I want to talk about one of my favorite prophets of all time, Jalal al-Din Rumi. He was a Sufi poet, a Muslim, whose words resonate with me so deeply today. Rumi says, "Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground." Elsewhere, Rumi writes, "Whatever you can think is perishable. That which enters no thought, that is God." And I see Rumi in his deep love of God, the same kind of love of God that I experience in Jesus. So I'm going to give you one last little poem from Rumi, who longs for God and writes this. "When I seek peace, he is the kindly intercessor. And when I go to war, the dagger, that is he. And when I come to meetings, he is the wine and the sweetmeat. And when I come to gardens, the fragrance, that is he. When I go to the mines deep, he is the ruby there. When I delve in the ocean, the precious pearl is he. When I come to the desert, he is a garden there. When I go to the heaven, the brilliant star is he. And when I write a letter to my beloved friends, the paper and the inkwell, the ink, the pen is he. And when I write a poem and seek a rhyming word, the one who spreads the rhymes out within my thought is he. We are the ancient ones. We are the forebearers choosing a course that will bring joy or suffering to trillions of people who follow us. Faith is the gift which sees other people's dignity. Faith is the way we act, how we respond to God's love. Faith is the question: what will you do with this wonderful, mysterious life that you have been given?